From New York, this is Democracy Now!
If the courts don't step in Missouri, we are going to see for the first time since Roe v. Wade a state that has had all of its abortion clinics shut down and eliminated. And that should be terrifying to all of us.
And then there was none. Missouri's only abortion clinic might be forced to close by Friday, effectively ending access to legal abortion in the state. We'll speak with the ACLU, as well as an abortion provider in neighboring Illinois, based just outside St. Louis. Then we go to Arizona, where a humanitarian volunteer with the group No More Deaths faces up to 20 years in prison for providing food, water, and aid to undocumented migrants.
In January of 2018, I was arrested by Border Patrol and charged with harboring. In the Border Patrol criminal complaint against me, they said that I was providing food, water, beds, and clean clothes to two men, and so they charged me with harboring.
Scott Warren goes on trial today, but will join us first. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As states around the country ramp up their attacks on reproductive rights, the Supreme Court Tuesday declined to rule on an Indiana law that would bar abortions based on sex, race, or disability of the fetus. The Supreme Court decision will keep in place a lower court's injunction on the measure. The Supreme Court, however, decided to allow Indiana's so-called fetal burial law to go into effect, which stipulates that abortion clinics must dispose of fetal remains either through burial or cremation. The measure was signed into law by then-Governor Mike Pence in 2016. In more reproductive rights news, the sole remaining women's health clinic that provides abortion in Missouri says it could be shut down by Friday. Planned Parenthood said it filed a lawsuit after Missouri's health department refused to renew its state license. A judge is scheduled to hear the case today. If Planned Parenthood's license to perform abortions is not renewed by Friday, Missouri would become the first state in the country without an abortion clinic since the 1973 landmark Roe v. Wade ruling. We'll have more on this and other reproductive rights news after headlines. Meanwhile, Netflix is the first major studio to threaten a boycott of Georgia in the wake of its passage of a 6-week abortion ban earlier this month. Chief Content Officer Ted Sarandos said Tuesday it would work with the ACLU to fight the law in court and would, quote, rethink Netflix's entire investment in Georgia if the law goes into effect. High-profile filmmakers and production companies, including Kristen Wiig, David Simon, Mark Duplass, Ron Howard, Killer Films, have said they will boycott Georgia, a major hub for film and television production, because of the new law. California Senator 2020 presidential hopeful Kamala Harris says if elected, she'll require states trying to pass anti-abortion measures that could violate Roe v. Wade to get pre-clearance through the federal government, similar to the Voting Rights Act. This is Senator Harris speaking to Lawrence O'Donnell during an MSNBC town hall Tuesday night about her proposed Reproductive Rights Act.
When elected, I'm going to put in place and require that states that have a history of passing legislation that is designed to prevent or limit a woman's access to reproductive health care, that those laws have to come before my Department of Justice for a review and approval, and until we determine that they are constitutional, they will not take effect.
A coalition of LGBTQ and reproductive rights groups are challenging a new Trump administration rule that would allow health care providers to decline abortions and other services for patients based on moral or religious beliefs. Lawyers argue the rule is unconstitutional and intentionally confusing. A statement on behalf of the plaintiffs says, quote, the rule is intentionally unworkable for healthcare facilities, including hospitals, and may result in these facilities doing away with reproductive and LGBTQ services altogether to avoid losing government funding, unquote. Back at the Supreme Court, justices decided not to hear a challenge to a Pennsylvania school district's policy allowing students to use bathrooms that correspond to their gender. Trans and civil rights activists applauded the news. Aiden DeStefano, a transgender graduate of Boyertown High, the school at the heart of the legal case, issued the following response via the ACLU. By the time I graduated high school, I was using the boys' bathroom and participating on the boys' cross-country team. I felt like I belonged and had the confidence I needed to continue with my education. I'm glad the Supreme Court is allowing schools like mine to continue supporting transgender students, he said. In more Supreme Court news, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said Tuesday he would move to confirm a President Trump-appointed nominee to the Supreme Court if a seat becomes vacant during next year's run-up to the general elections. In 2016, McConnell led a Republican effort to block President Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, to the Supreme Court following Justice Antonin Scalia's death, arguing voters should decide whether a Democratic or a Republican president would fill the opening based on the results of the 2016 election. German Chancellor Angela Merkel said Europe must fight against the right-wing ideology that's on the rise in Europe and around the world. In an interview with CNN's Christiane Amanpour following the European Parliament elections, which saw some gains for nationalist parties, Merkel stressed the importance of learning from Germany's own history.
There is, to this day, not a single synagogue, not a single daycare center for Jewish children, not a single school for Jewish children that does not need to be guarded by German policemen. We have to face up indeed to the specters of the past. We have to tell our young people what history has brought over us and others, and these horrors, why we are for democracy, why we try to bring about solutions, why we always have to put ourselves in the other person's shoes.
On Saturday, Germany's anti-Semitism commissioner advised Jews in the country to avoid wearing kippas or yarmulkes in public because of the rise in anti-Semitism. German government figures show anti-Semitic hate crimes rose by almost 20% from 2017 to 18. In Syria, over 20 civilians were killed Tuesday as attacks in the northwestern rebel stronghold of Idlib continue by government and Russian forces. 9 children were among the dead, according to the Britain-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. The United Nations is warning 3 million people in Idlib are caught in the crosshairs of the fighting and blasted the international community's lack of action in the face of the growing humanitarian crisis. In Brazil, at least 55 prisoners were killed as fights broke out across 4 prisons in the northwestern state of Amazonas. 15 prisoners were found dead Sunday and 40 on Monday in what authorities say were gang-related riots. The deaths were caused by strangulation and stabbing. Leaders of the suspected gangs are being transferred to maximum security prisons. Brazil has the 3rd largest prison population in the world. According to a local human rights group, one of the prisons where riots broke out was housing more than twice its prisoner capacity. Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who campaigned on a law and order platform, has said he would, quote, stuff prison cells with criminals. In more news from Brazil, a nonprofit environmental group is warning deforestation in the Amazon rainforest increased by 20% in just the last 9 months. Experts say logging and land invasion are to blame for much of the loss. President Bolsonaro and his environment minister have worked to open the Amazon even further to logging, mining, and agribusiness companies while violating the land rights of indigenous peoples. Earlier this month, 8 former environment ministers warned Bolsonaro's administration was systematically destroying Brazil's environmental policies, with one former minister saying Brazil was becoming an exterminator of the future. Malaysia will send up to 3,000 tons of plastic waste back to the countries it came from in an attempt to halt wealthier countries from dumping their used plastic under the guise of recycling. Malaysia became the world's main dumping ground for plastic refuse after China banned its importation last year. The plastic smuggled to unlicensed recycling plants from countries including the United States, the UK, France, Canada, and Australia, and is causing environmental problems for surrounding communities. This is Malaysian Minister of Energy, Yeo Bee Yin.
So what the citizens of the UK believe that they send for recycling is actually dumped in our country. Malaysians, like any other developing countries, have a right to clean air, clean water, sustainable resources, and clean environment to live in, just like citizens of developed nations.
In the United States, a $19 billion disaster relief bill continues to stall in the House as Republican Congressmember Thomas Massie objected to its passage Tuesday by demanding an official roll call vote, following a similar move last week by fellow Republican lawmaker Chip Roy. The bill passed handily in the Senate last week, but the objecting Congress members cited the lack of border wall funding, among other reasons, for their opposition. The bill would send relief funds to western states hit by wildfires, Midwestern states dealing with flooding, and hurricane-ravaged areas in the southeast and Puerto Rico, as well as to farmers affected by natural disasters. House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer said Democrats will attempt to pass the bill on a voice vote Thursday, or failing that, would pass the bill after lawmakers return from their recess next week. Recent research shows e-cigarettes may pose an increased risk of heart attack. A new study in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology has found the substance used to flavor e-cigarettes can threaten the survival and proper functioning of human cells. The study's author says the research refutes the common perception of vaping as a safe alternative to smoking regular cigarettes. The Food and Drug Administration said last year vaping had increased nearly 80% among high school students and 50% among middle school students over the previous year. And in more public health news, the measles outbreak has now hit over half of U.S. states. 60 new cases were identified over the past week, bringing the total to 940 cases in 26 states so far this year. New York has the highest number of new infections, according to the Centers for Disease Control. Experts expect the number of cases to exceed the outbreak of 1994, in which 958 cases were identified. Public health officials blame lower vaccination rates based on misinformation for current surge in infected people. Meanwhile, Maine became the fourth state, along with California, Mississippi, and West Virginia, to end most non-medical exemptions for childhood vaccines. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. This is not a drill. This is not a warning. This is real, and it's a public health crisis. Those were the words of Planned Parenthood President Leana Wen Tuesday when news broke that Missouri's only abortion clinic might be forced to close by the end of this week, effectively ending access to legal abortion in the state. As Republican legislatures across the country attack reproductive rights with a wave of anti-abortion bills, this threat is coming from the state of Missouri itself. Planned Parenthood says that Missouri's health department is threatening not to renew its license over a series of unreasonable demands, including interviewing 7 of the clinic's doctors. Dr. Colleen McNicholas, an abortion provider at the clinic, told reporters, quote, "This is harassment and attempted intimidation of doctors at the highest levels of government." Missouri is one of 6 states in the country with just 1 abortion clinic left. The others are Kentucky, Mississippi, North Dakota, South Dakota, and West Virginia. If Missouri fails to renew the license by May 31st, it will become the first state without any abortion services since Roe v. Wade recognized the constitutional right to abortion in 1973. Planned Parenthood has filed a lawsuit to stop the clinic's closure. A hearing is scheduled for this afternoon in St. Louis.
This comes less than a week after Missouri's Republican Governor Mike Parsons signed a law banning abortions at 8 weeks of pregnancy, with no exceptions in cases of rape or incest. The law will trigger a total ban if Roe v. Wade is overturned. The same day Planned Parenthood announced the threats to its last clinic in Missouri, on Tuesday the Supreme Court declined to take up a provision of an Indiana law that bars abortions based on sex, race, or disability of the fetus. The decision keeps in place a lower court injunction on the measure. The Supreme Court, however, decided to allow Indiana's so-called fetal burial law to go into effect, which stipulates abortion clinics must dispose of fetal remains either through burial or cremation. The measure was signed into law by then-Governor, now Vice President, Mike Pence in 2016. Well, for more, we're joined by two guests. In St. Louis, Missouri, we go to Dr. Erin King, OBGYN and Executive Director of the Hope Clinic for Women in Granite City, Illinois, which is about 10 minutes from downtown St. Louis, Missouri. Here in New York, we're joined by Alexa Colby-Molina, Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project. She recently filed the ACLU challenge to the Alabama abortion ban. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's begin with Dr. Erin King. You are minutes from the St. Louis Women's Health Clinic that provides abortion. Explain what is happening this week. Before we move on to the Supreme Court, what could happen by Friday with Missouri's last remaining women's health clinic that provides abortion?
Well, thank you for having me on the show this morning. We're really, really concerned here in Missouri. I'm a Missouri resident. Right now, I'm sitting literally about a couple of miles from the last remaining clinic. And the news that broke yesterday about the fact that the Missouri State Health Department is threatening to shut this clinic down based on unreasonable demands is most concerning for the patients in the state of Missouri. We are really literally in a crisis right now where the patients in our own state in Missouri cannot access safe reproductive health care as of Friday. So right now, I happen to be fortunate enough not just to be a gynecologist and provide abortion care, but to do that in Illinois. And I really I'm really predicting seeing a high number of patients having to start to travel across state lines just to receive the health care that they seek.
And Dr. King, in terms of what you've already, what your clientele already is in Illinois, could you talk about that? Because given the fact that there's only one clinic left in Missouri right now that can provide abortions.
The Hope Clinic for Women, where I'm the executive director and also a physician, we have seen patients for over 45 years, many of whom are from Missouri. So we already see patients, over 50% of our patients come from Missouri. In the last 2 years, with a significant number of restrictions around abortion in Missouri, we've already seen a very, very high number of patients have to come over to Illinois to see us. I expect that number will increase significantly. Just yesterday, as the news was breaking about the health clinic potentially being shut down, Planned Parenthood potentially being shut down on Friday, we already had a flood of phone calls of very panicked and frantic patients wondering what was going on, where they can go, where they can seek care. So we're already really concerned that there's a lot of confusion around this issue. And unfortunately, not all patients can just pick up and drive across the state line to seek care.
Dr. King, can you explain what is happening by Friday? Why suddenly, it seems, we're just talking about licensing of the clinic, something that happens every single year. Now, your husband is also an abortion provider, right, in the St. Louis Planned Parenthood Clinic.
Right, correct. So what is happening is that every year, and this is a law that's in Missouri, every year the abortion clinic has to apply and be accepted for a new license as this abortion facility, which comes with a lot of regulations above and beyond the usual regulations around healthcare. And the Missouri State Health Department has stated that they don't think that the Planned Parenthood in St. Louis can comply with these regulations. And they're forcing the doctors to go through interrogations. They're forcing, I think you said at the beginning of the program, so I don't want to misspeak, but 7 of the doctors to go through interrogations just to get this licensing through. The Planned Parenthood in St. Louis are close colleagues of ours at Hope Clinic. We work with them on a day-to-day basis. We know the health care they provide is very safe. It is high quality. It is well within the standards of medical care. And shutting down the clinic based on new allegations and interrogations just based on harassment and intimidation does nothing to improve the health or safety of the patients in the state of Missouri.
I wanted to ask you, what kind of problems do you confront being being a provider with even in Illinois in terms of potential harassment, or do you have any fears for yourself in terms of your own safety, given some of the ongoing protests and even violence that have occurred against other abortion providers around the country?
So I've been a gynecologist for 15 years, and I do a lot of different work as a gynecologist. I do work specifically doing abortion care, and I do feel harassment from protesters, from people who believe that abortion should be illegal. That has been a long-standing issue, and it does feel scary to provide care that there are people that don't agree with you and have in the past been violent against providers who provide that care. I think this is a whole new level of concern where we are actually scared of our own health department in Missouri. I am also a licensed physician in Missouri, and it really is intimidating to think that our own state health department could suddenly turn on you for providing legal, safe care that is well within the standards of medical practice. So I think this is a whole new level of concern, and I'm concerned for our patients. I think patients are hearing in states across the country that their care could be criminalized. Our governor in Missouri on Friday signed a ban into law that would prevent abortion after the 8th week of pregnancy. And I think patients themselves are feeling now not just the harassment that the providers feel from the outside, but also from their own state.
You know, Friday, that date that the clinic can close, the last women's health clinic that provides abortion in Missouri. It will be the first state not to have one at all. Friday is the 10th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. George Tiller, who was shot dead at the Reformation Lutheran Church in Wichita, Kansas, May 31st, 2009. But I wanted to take up that issue of the governor's signing of the ban, Missouri's Republican Governor Mike Parsons signing that ban on abortions at 8 weeks of pregnancy with no exceptions in cases of rape or incest, the law triggering a total ban if Roe v. Wade is overturned. During a debate over the new anti-abortion bill, the Republican Missouri state legislator, Barry Hovis, said rape by a stranger should be distinguished by what he called, quote, consensual rape.
Just say someone goes out and they have, or they're raped or they're sexually assaulted one night after a college party. Because most of my rapes were not the gentleman jumping out of the bushes that nobody had ever met. That was 1 or 2 times out of 100. Most of them were date rapes or consensual rapes, which were all terrible. But I'd sat in court when juries would struggle with those type of situations where it was a he said, she said, and they would find the person not guilty.
That's Republican state legislator Barry Hovis saying rape by a stranger is different from rape by consensual rape. Well, I also want to turn to the powerful words of Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, and she's now a New York Times columnist. She recently wrote about her own abortion in a column titled, "My Rapist Apologized. I Still Needed an Abortion." She writes, "I wondered how a rape exception to an abortion ban could possibly help women like me, who did not want to report a rape to the police and who could not possibly prove that a rape occurred if the man denied it. Criminal cases take months, even years, to be resolved. Would abortions be allowed based on mere allegations of rape without any proof? If not, what would a woman have to prove in a matter of days or weeks to get an abortion in the first trimester? How could she overcome the inevitable denial? What man would admit to rape knowing that he'd face a likely prison sentence?" Those are the words of Michelle Alexander in her recent New York Times column. I want to bring in Alexa Colby-Molina, senior staff attorney at the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project. Your response to both Hovis, this Missouri state legislator, and what Michelle Alexander said.
No, I think that before this year, we wouldn't have even seen abortion bans like this being proposed without a rape and incest exception. So what we're seeing now is just an unprecedented rise in the extremism and in the radical nature of these bans. You know, before this year, politicians would have been afraid to even introduce a ban like that, and now they feel emboldened. But nonetheless, I think, as Michelle Alexander's column really aptly points out, at the end of the day, an abortion ban is an abortion ban. And these exceptions for rape and incest for far too many people just provide no help at all. So really, an abortion ban with or without one of these exceptions is going to be just as damaging to people.
I wanted to ask you, as you mentioned, this onslaught now of legislation across the country, it seems almost a deliberate effort just at this particular point by the Republican majorities in different state legislatures to begin a whole new culture war here on the issue or to ramp up the culture wars just in the run-up to a new presidential election to mobilize their own base. It's so opportunistic that at this particular moment, all of a sudden, all of these bills are being passed across the country almost in a coordinated fashion.
Oh, you're absolutely right. This is definitely a ramping up, and it is definitely a coordinated strategy. Since 2011, we have actually seen more than 400 restrictions on abortions passed in state legislatures. But what's happening this year is definitely a national and concerted effort by politicians who have really been emboldened by President Trump's anti-abortion agenda to really ratchet it up a notch and now take direct aim at Roe v. Wade with abortion bans. So that's really what we're seeing. It's this campaign that has been developing over time, but is absolutely ramping up and reaching a new stage this year.
Now, of course, you took on the abortion ban in Alabama, which is also no exception for rape or incest. We're now talking about Missouri, one of 6 states with just one abortion clinic left. The others, Kentucky, Mississippi, North and South Dakota, and West Virginia. On Tuesday, the Supreme Court declined to take up, now this is really hard to understand, declined to take up a provision of an Indiana law that bars abortions based on sex, race, or disability of the fetus, the decision keeping in place a lower court injunction on the measure. But Clarence Thomas, Supreme Court Justice, indicated in a 20-page opinion he supports the law, writing, enshrining a constitutional right to an abortion based solely on the race, sex, or disability of an unborn child, as Planned Parenthood advocates, would constitutionalize the views of the 20th century eugenics movement. Can you decipher what this is about? And also, what was upheld in the case of the Indiana law that Mike Pence signed off on when he was governor, and what the Supreme Court refused to rule on?
Sure. So in Indiana, like in so many other states, again, we have seen just an onslaught of restrictions designed both at pushing abortion care out of reach, but also stigmatizing and shaming the people who access abortion care. So what happened yesterday was that there were 2 laws in Indiana, one which has to do with disposal of fetal tissue, and the other, which was really an unprecedented, intrusive law that tried to ban abortions based on the reason that the person was seeking the abortion. No such law has ever been upheld in any state. And so what we got from the Supreme Court was a mixed decision. The lower courts had struck down both of those provisions. The Supreme Court said, with respect to the ban on abortions based on a person's reason, we're going to let the decision of the lower courts stand, meaning that law is never going to take effect. It was blocked, it was held unconstitutional, and that's not going to change. The other decision on the other law it's important to, I think, understand about that law that it actually wasn't brought under the Roe v. Wade line of cases. So it really wasn't a direct challenge or not to the access to abortion. There was no evidence that law was actually stopping the fetal tissue disposal law was actually preventing anybody from getting an abortion or would prevent anybody. So really, while it's unfortunate because we know that the purpose of that law is really to shame and stigmatize people who seek abortion care, the Supreme Court's decision in allowing that law to stand isn't going to interfere with access to abortion. And of course, what we saw from Justice Thomas's occurrence is really something that is just driving so many of these laws, which is just the utter distrust of people who choose to terminate their pregnancies, a belief that anybody who makes that personal and private decision that it's just not the right time for them and their family to have a child could be doing something discriminatory, could be acting as a eugenicist. It just shows such a lack of distrust. And it's quite offensive to the 1 in 4 women in this country who choose to have abortions for reasons that are entirely their own and really personal to their family and their circumstances.
So what happens? The injunction just stands and this will not go into effect in Indiana?
Exactly. The injunction stands and it will not.
But fetal burial does. And talk about what that means and the expense incurred, and also what it means psychologically when you're saying that the fetus must be buried or cremated. What about if you have a miscarriage?
I mean, this was one of the irrational elements of the law, which I think had been pointed out in the lawsuit, and which is why the lower courts had enjoined it. Obviously, when a person has a miscarriage at home, none of these restrictions would apply. They are only targeted at abortion clinics. So again, it really goes to show you what the motivation here was. This is part of the just numerous restrictions. You heard from Dr. King talking about the numerous regulations and licensing requirements that abortion clinics have to comply with that really go above and beyond anything else any other medical provider has to comply with. And so really this is just part and parcel of those burdens. And again, just going back to these attempts to shame and stigmatize abortion care, to really marginalize it from the rest of health care, which is exactly what it is.
Now, you've filed a challenge to the Alabama law. How do you see these various challenges of this raft of laws across the country proceeding over the next year or two? Is it likely that this is going to reach the Supreme Court and have a decision before the presidential election, or is it more likely that it would happen afterward?
It takes years. It can take years for cases to reach the Supreme Court. So I'm not sure that any of these cases are on the fast track to get up to the Supreme Court. And again, of course, as we saw on Tuesday, the Supreme Court doesn't even take all the cases that come to it. So when it comes to these bans, like we've seen in Ohio and Kentucky and Alabama and Missouri and Georgia, I'm very confident that the lower courts are going to block these bans and are going to prevent them from taking effect. And I think it's very important that people know that abortion today is still legal in all 50 states in the country. And, as Dr. King mentioned, and as the providers in Alabama have found, they are getting calls from people every day to the clinics, terrified, panicked that abortion is already illegal. So it's definitely very important, I think, to get the message out there that these bans, they are going to be blocked, and abortion remains legal in all 50 states.
Final comment from Dr. Erin King, right there on the front line, right over the border from St. Louis in Illinois, executive director of the Hope Clinic for Women in Granite City, Illinois. As this clinic is about to close, again, just repeating this, on May 31st, unless, the court case that's going to be heard today, something happens with that. Well, again, on that 10th anniversary of Dr. George Tiller's assassination, an abortion provider in Kansas, how you're all protecting yourselves, Dr. King.
We are just trying to get the message out to patients that abortion is legal, that they still have access, and that we're trying to let them know where they have access and how they can get the health care that they're seeking. That is the best protection for our patients, is giving them accurate information and trying to reach out to them in a compassionate way that destigmatizes the care that they're seeking and tells them there are people that care about you, there are people that will take care of you, and you will get good, high-quality medical care, and we are here to take care of you.
Dr. King, we want to thank you so much for being with us, and we want to thank Lexi Colby-Molina, Senior Staff Attorney at the ACLU Reproductive Freedom Project. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. When we come back, a man who attempted to provide water for undocumented migrants coming over the border from Mexico in the desert, so many have died, faces 20 years in prison. He goes on trial today. Stay with us.
I want you more than I need you.
Waiting by Alice Bowman. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We turn now to southern Arizona, where a humanitarian aid volunteer is heading to trial today for providing food, water, and shelter to 2 undocumented migrants. Scott Warren of Ajo, Arizona, faces up to 20 years in prison after being charged with 3 felony counts for allegedly harboring undocumented migrants. Warren is a geographer who volunteers with No More Deaths and Ajo Samaritans, 2 southern Arizona-based humanitarian aid organizations. For years, the groups have left water and food in the harsh Sonoran Desert to help refugees and migrants survive the deadly journey across the U.S. border.
Warren was arrested January 17, 2018, just hours after No More Deaths released a report detailing how U.S. border agents had intentionally destroyed more than 3,000 gallons of water left out for migrants crossing the border. The group also published a video showing border agents dumping out jugs of water in the desert. Hours after the report was published, authorities raided Warren's home in Ajo, where they found 2 migrants who'd sought temporary refuge. Amnesty International and other human rights groups are now calling for the charges to be dropped against Warren. In a moment, Scott Warren will join us from Tucson, but first I want to turn to a short documentary by Laura Sanders for The Intercept about the work of humanitarian aid workers, including Warren on the border. It's titled Let Them Have Water.
We savor our desert, but this desert right around our town where we recreate held 57 bodies, 57 remains of human beings last year. 57. Do you find remains in your parks, in your golf courses, in your neighborhood playgrounds? What would that make you feel like?
May the spirits of our brothers and sisters walk in beauty for eternity. Thank you, Creator.
I'm Scott Warren, and I'm a geographer. And I've lived in Ajo for about 6 years now. The moment that really changed for me, got me involved in a big way, was moving here to Ajo and just experiencing the border in a more visceral way, being here in the summer, running into people in the desert who had walked across the desert and were in need of water, meeting other folks who were doing humanitarian aid. It just seemed like, if not the most important, one of the most important issues facing this place. For me, to not be involved in that would be like not being fully engaged and fully present in this place. So groups like No More Deaths and Samaritans, Humane Borders, Águilas del Desierto, and the Armadillos, for instance, have all provided humanitarian aid and done search and rescue in different ways here in the desert. We went from finding human remains every other month to like finding 5 sets of human remains on a single trip, hiking through the Growler Valley, and then going back, a week later and finding 2 more sets of remains, and then on a single day of searching, finding like 8 sets of remains and bodies of people who had died in adjacent areas of the bombing range and on Cabeza Prieta. So just this like scale of this crisis, of the humanitarian crisis and the missing persons crisis, just blew wide open.
My name is Cesar Ortigosa, and I'm the president of Armadillo Search and Rescue. We've been doing this for almost 6 years. We're planning on sticking together for a long time. This work is really necessary for the families that are in need of our help.
Yeah, we're going to La Muela right now.
¿A dónde van? ¿A La Muela?
La Muela, yeah, we're searching for a guy that was left out there.
What, you're searching for a body?
Yeah.
Is it just one that you know of, or?
Yeah, well, there is three actually.
3?
Okay.
But one of them is the more recent. And it's really...
We hope to find them today.
It's really grateful to have all these people, these volunteers, because we might belong to different families. We're We might not even be related to each other, but inside here, we have to be a family, you know.
In your hands, Lord, we ask this morning that you help us reach the place where the people that need your help are. Father, we ask this so that we can help them, as it is the mission we carry in our hearts.
Don Julio. We just have to be realistic and know that we have to be strong. You know, even though it breaks our hearts to find these remainings, we have to be strong and keep on going. You know, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do this job. About 3 months ago, we found the remains from a little boy or girl, probably 5, 6 years old, and it's really sad to think what they had to go through and how they died, and knowing that their families won't be able to see them anymore. It's really, really hard. You know, but we have to keep on doing it. You know, it's really necessary. Our responsibility is to give them the coordinates, and once they have it, that's really up to them if they come over and get him.
In January of 2018, I was arrested by Border Patrol and charged with harboring. In the Border Patrol criminal complaint against me, they said that I was providing food, water, beds, and clean clothes to 2 men. And so they charged me with harboring. Went through Border Patrol custody, then appeared in front of a judge and was released on my own recognizance. And that was over a year ago, and we've been engaged in various legal proceedings leading up to a potential trial sometime later this year.
I'm Mimi Phillips. I moved to Ajo about 15 years ago, and about 8 or 9 years ago, a group of us began a small version of the Samaritans here. I guess every time I look at Scott, I think of my own son. And it's unconscionable to think that he's been charged with felonies for doing what, as a parent, I would be so proud of what he'd done. And I know his parents are proud.
People have always crossed in the Ajo area. People have always been walking through the desert. People have always been finding ways to come here through the desert. But what happened is it was turned into a major industrial scale operation in the 1990s and early 2000s as they really pushed people out into places like these, these deserts and mountains. What had been really a small scale thing, local organizations that move people and goods through the desert, a small handful of Border Patrol agents that might go out and try to interdict people or might be involved in, finding people who had died, or local residents who would respond to people who needed food and water. That all just completely mushroomed into this massive, massive industry.
Where you say, enough, whatever the consequences are, enough.
Drivers with permits should come together to be able to approach law enforcement, and everyone else.
How many more bodies? It's just not okay. We're here, and we will leave the water, and we are a real community that isn't a scary place to live.
I think one important thing is that people here in Ajo and other local communities on the border have always been providing humanitarian aid and have always responded to people being in need. people here have, provided food and water to folks who are crossing the desert who are in desperate condition. They've responded to rescue people who are in the desert. They've found and recovered the bodies and the bones of people who have died in the desert. So that's been going on for forever, basically, and has been a fact of life for people who live here.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
I want to start off by saying who I am. I'm Jose Castillo, and I've been around here for almost 80 years. We honor these individuals today with the reading of their names. Please respond with presente when the name is called. Desconocido.
Presente.
Let Them Have Water, a short documentary by Laura Sanders for The Intercept. When we come back, we go to Tucson to speak with Scott Warren, who was arrested in January of 2018 in Ajo, Arizona. He goes on trial today. Stay with us.
Buscando tu sonrisa estaría toda mi vida. Quiero ser la única que te muerda la boca. Quiero saber que la vida contigo no va a terminar. Déjame que te cierre esta noche los ojos y mañana vendré con un cigarro a la cama. Porque no tengo más intenciones que seguir bebiendo de esta copa que no está tan rota. Quiero ser la única que te muerda la boca. Quiero saber que la vida contigo no va a terminar. Porque sí, porque sí, porque en esta vida no quiero pasar un día.
Julieta Venegas, this is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We're joined now in Tucson, Arizona by Scott Warren, the humanitarian aid volunteer who's heading to trial today for providing aid to 2 undocumented migrants. He faces up to 20 years in prison after being charged with 3 felony counts for allegedly harboring undocumented migrants. He was arrested in January 2018 at a location called The Barn, which was used by humanitarian volunteers. Warren is a geographer who volunteers with No More Deaths and Ajo Samaritans.
We're also joined in Tucson by another member of No More Deaths, Catherine Gaffney. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Scott, why don't you lay out what happened on that day in January 2018 when you were at the barn, as well as other volunteers. Explain who exactly raided and what happened to you there.
Thanks. I was at the barn, which is a property in Ajo that's used by a variety of humanitarian groups that stage from that property to go out into the desert and put out water and do search and rescue and that sort of thing. On that day in January of 2018, we were preparing for a group of high school students to arrive who were going to volunteer to do some of this humanitarian work. It's a pretty common thing that student groups will volunteer. And on that day, a couple of Border Patrol agents had set up surveillance kind of across the way from the barn at an area where they could kind of watch what was happening there. And at some point,